Before the world had shape, before the oceans knew their edges, or the mountains had learned their names, what was there in the oldest whispers of Japanese mythology? Whispers carried down through countless centuries, like smoke rising from sacred incense. There lived two divine beings suspended above a churning, formless sea. They were given a jeweled spear and a tremendous task: to stir chaos into creation itself. But creation, as the ancient Japanese knew well, is never truly separate from its twin, for every island coaxed from the deep, every god breathed into being, there is a shadow following close behind, a door left open, a bargain broken in the dark. This is a story of love, stretched across the boundary between the living and the dead, of a husband who walked into the underworld for the sake of what he had lost, and what terrible thing he saw when he looked back. Welcome to the story of Izanagi and Izanami. Now lie back, breathe slowly, and let the ancient world take over. Before the mountains had their names, before the rivers knew which way to run, there was only the deep, a vast and formless deep, still and without boundary, where everything that might one day exist drifted in a slow, undreaming darkness. And the darkness was not empty exactly. It held within it the memory of what the world would one day become, the way a seed holds in its small and silent heart the whole unfolding of a forest. In those first immeasurable ages, the heavy and the slow sank downward, settling into what would become the earth. The light and the swift rose upward, thinning into what would become the sky. Between these two, between the weight below and the brightness above, there stretched a trembling middle place, formless as breath, where neither earth nor sky had yet decided what to be. The ancient ones called this place the beginning, though it had no edges and no name. High above all of this, far up in the clear and luminous heavens, the first gods had gathered. They were the celestial ones, the ones who had always been, whose origins lay deeper than memory and older than story. They watched the formless deep far below them with patient, knowing eyes. They could see what it might become. They could see the green hills sleeping inside the gray water, the rivers curled like slumbering serpents, the forests waiting in the dark like held breath. The world was there in every possibility. It simply had not yet been called into being. So it was that the celestial gods turned to two among them, a god and a goddess, young as the first morning, luminous with purpose. The god was Izanagi, the goddess was Izanami. They stood together before the gathered heavens, and the elder gods looked upon them with something that moved like warmth through still water. Into Izanagi's hands the celestial ones placed the jeweled spear of heaven. It was a thing of great and quiet beauty, long and smooth, its shaft worn to a deep luster by the hands of heaven, its tip adorned with 7 jewels that caught the light of the upper world and held it, the way still water holds the reflection of a star. It was not a weapon. It had never been made for harm. It was a tool of creation, an instrument for coaxing the raw and wandering matter of the world into form, the way a slow hand might stir cream into cloud. The elder gods spoke their instructions gently, in voices like the sound of wind passing through the upper reaches of very tall trees. They told Izanagi and Izanami of the floating bridge, a bridge that arched down from the floor of heaven toward the surface of the formless deep below. They were to descend together to the edge of that bridge, lean out over the unformed waters, and lower the jeweled spear into the deep. They were to stir. They were to coax. They were to wait for what the world wished to become. Izanagi held the spear with both hands and felt its weight, not heavy, exactly, but full the way the moment before dawn is full, when the darkness softens at its edges and everything leans forward. Beside him, Izanami stood still and listening. She had the quality of deep water about her, calm on the surface and immeasurably deep beneath. She looked out toward the edge of heaven, toward the bridge that curved away into the pale and open distance, and her eyes were soft with something that was not quite wonder and not quite knowing, but lived somewhere between the two. Together, they moved toward the floating bridge of heaven. The bridge was made of nothing that could be easily named. It seemed to shimmer at its edges, as though the air around it could not quite settle into certainty. Beneath it, so far below that distance, ceased to mean anything familiar. The formless deep drifted in slow, oily circles, dark and silver, silver and dark, moving without purpose, without memory, without end. The smell that rose from it was neither sweet nor bitter. It was the smell of everything, undivided. Izanagi and Izanami walked the bridge together, step by quiet step, until the solid certainty of heaven was behind them, and there was only the bridge beneath their feet and the vast formless world below. The bridge swayed just slightly. Or perhaps it was the deep that moved. It was difficult to say. Izanagi leaned out over the edge. The jeweled spear of heaven extended before him, its 7 jewels catching nothing but the faint and sourceless light of a world not yet awake. He held it there, at the boundary between heaven and the formless deep. He held it there, and the deep rose faintly to meet it. Curious, perhaps. Patient, certainly. Izanami placed her hand beside his on the shaft of the spear. Her fingers were warm. Then, together, they lowered the tip of the jeweled spear into the deep, and slowly, gently, they began to stir. The ocean answered them, not with a roar or a shudder, but with something softer, a slow waking, a turning of deep waters that had never been turned before. The jeweled spear moved in their hands like a living thing, tracing wide circles through the formless dark below, and wherever it passed, the water thickened and shimmered and began very gradually to remember itself. For a long while, there was only that, the sound of the stirring, the faint salt smell rising from the deep, and the two of them standing together, on the bridge of heaven, patient as the stars above them. Then Izanagi drew the spear upward. From its tip, the water fell back in slow, heavy drops. And where those drops landed on the surface of the sea, something gathered, something held. The drops did not dissolve back into the deep, but instead clung to one another, drawn together by some quiet longing, building and settling and rising above the waterline. Drop by shining drop, grain by grain of salt and silence, the first island lifted itself from the ocean. They called it Onogoro, the island that formed itself. It rose slowly the way all true things rise, without hurry, without fanfare. Just a low and steady emergence, a pale shore appearing where there had been nothing, dark rock hardening beneath a skin of wet sand, the smell of brine and new earth mingling in the still air. The clouds that had gathered above shifted and parted, and for the first time light fell on land. Izanagi and Izanami descended the floating bridge together, stepping from the luminous span of heaven down onto the shore of their new island. The sand was cool and damp beneath their feet. The sea moved in gentle rings around them. The world was very quiet, very new, and full of an extraordinary stillness. The stillness of something that has just begun. They walked the whole of Onogoro that first long day, learning its contours the way one learns the features of a beloved face. Here was a ridge of black stone, still warm from the churning. There a shallow pool where the ocean had lingered and the first small creatures moved through the shallows without names. A wind came in off the water, hesitant, the way a first wind would be, and moved the surface of the pool into soft wrinkles. And Izanami laughed, and the sound of her laughter settled over the island like warmth. They made their home there at the heart of Onogoro, beneath a sky that was slowly learning its own colors. And from that home, they made the world. It happened tenderly, in the manner of all great making, not through force or command, but through closeness and care and the patient accumulation of days. In their union, the larger islands were born one by one, rising from the sea as their names were spoken, as their shapes were dreamed into being. Each island arrived in its own way, with its own temperament, its own quality of light. Some emerged from storms, their coasts all jagged and dramatic. Others rose gently, wrapped in mist, wearing their mountains lightly. The long arc of islands stretched across the water like a string of dark jewels, each one distinct, each one whole. They were Awaji and Iyo, Oki and Sakushi, Iki and Tsushima, and great Yamato at the heart of them all, broad and green, and breathing slowly in the sea air. The world was filling in, the way a painting fills in, first the broad shapes, then the detail, then the life. Still the making continued. Because the islands alone were not enough. Land without river is only stone. Stone without wind is only silence. And so Izanagi and Izanami turned next to the gods, the children of their love who would govern and sustain the world they had called into being. First came the god of wind. He arrived as a breath across the open water, invisible and restless, running his fingers through the grass on the hillsides, lifting the surface of the sea into long, slow swells. Where he passed, things moved and rustled and whispered. He had no fixed form, but his presence was everywhere at once, and the world was grateful for him. Then the gods of sea and current, deep and steady, who settled into the water with the ease of things returning home. The sea had been formless before them, but now it had moods. Now it had directions and intentions and the long patience of tides. The shores of every island learned the rhythm of their breathing. The god of mountains came next, massive and unhurried, pulling the land upward from inside, raising the ridgelines and high passes, filling the horizons with shapes that would endure for 10,000 years. He carried in him the smell of pine and cold stone and the particular silence that lives above the tree line, where the air is thin and the sky is very close. And so the rivers followed, winding down from those high places, singing through the valleys, finding their way to the sea with the inevitability of water, which always knows where it belongs. Each river brought with it the god of its own voice, the low murmur of deep channels, the quick, bright chatter of mountain streams, the wide and wordless hush of rivers nearing their mouths. Island by island, element by element, deity by deity, the world was woven. Izanagi and Izanami moved through all of it with a kind of quiet wonder, the way parents move through a house grown full of life, pausing to listen, marveling at what has come from them. They had not forced any of it into being. They had simply opened themselves to the making, and the making had answered. The world grew around them the way a garden grows, reaching toward light, filling every available silence with something green, and reaching. The days had a sweetness to them then. The light on the water in the mornings, the sound of wind in the new grass, the mountains standing still and enormous against a sky that had finally found all its colors, the pale wash of dawn, the deep, burning amber of late afternoon, and at night the long blue dark pricked through with stars, countless and cold and beautiful. They rested sometimes on the shores of Onogoro, where they had first set foot on land, and looked out at what they had made. The islands lay scattered across the sea in the gently fading light, each one a world in its own particular way. The gods they had given life to moved through the world now, tending it, shaping it, sustaining the great slow turning of things. Izanami would sometimes rest her head against Izanagi's shoulder in those quiet evening hours, and he would feel the warmth of her and the immensity of all they had shared. And neither of them would speak, because there was nothing that needed saying. The world was young and full and whole. For a time, for a long, luminous time, it seemed as though nothing would ever diminish it. Content. But then came Kagutsuchi. He arrived as all fire arrives, suddenly without permission, filling the world with a light that was not gentle. Izanami labored long to bring him forth, and when at last the child came, he came blazing. The god of fire was luminous and fierce and utterly, terribly alive, and the very act of his birth seared his mother from within. The flames were not cruel. They knew no cruelty. They simply were what they were, hungry, reaching, impossible to hold, and Izanami, who had given form to islands and breath to rivers, could not contain them. She burned from the inside out, slowly at first, and then all at once, the way a paper lantern burns when the flame inside it grows too large for the space. She lay down upon the earth she had helped to make. Izanagi came to her and took her hand, and the hand was very warm. He pressed it between both of his and did not speak for a long time. Around them, the world they had woven together, the mountains, the sea wind, the green slopes dropping softly toward the shore, continued on, as the world does, indifferent to the anguish of even its own makers. She looked at him with eyes that were already beginning to grow distant, already turning toward some threshold he could not yet see. "Nin, I am going somewhere," she said, and her voice was like an ember, still warm but fading. He said nothing, because there were no words shaped for this moment. There were no gods of grief yet, no rituals of farewell. This was the first death in all the world, and neither of them knew how to meet it. She left him quietly, the way the last light leaves the sky at the close of an autumn day, not all at once, but gently, and then completely. And the world, so recently, young and full and whole, was neither of those things any more. Izanagi wept. He wept the way mountains weep in spring, when the ice that has held them all winter finally releases, slowly, overwhelmingly, from somewhere deep inside. His tears fell upon the earth, and some say that where they struck the ground, small flowers grew up, pale and fragrant, though no one had planted them. He lay beside her and breathed in the last of her warmth and did not move for a long time. Then the grief turned, as deep grief sometimes does, into something harder. He looked at Kagutsuchi, the fire child, blazing still, unknowing, innocent of what his birth had cost. And what rose in Izanagi was not love. None. He drew his blade. It is said that from the pieces of the fire god, from the blood and the light that scattered across the earth and sky, still more gods were born, gods of stone and rain, of thunder and mountain shadow. Even in his anguish, Even in the act of his grief-blind fury, Izanagi could not help but make the world larger. Such was the nature of what he was. Nothing comforted him. Nothing comforted him. He returned to where Izanami lay, and he sat with her through the long, still hours. As the light moved across the sky and the sea murmured somewhere beyond the hills, the sound of the world seemed muffled now, as though it understood that something irreplaceable had passed out of it. In time, he became aware that she was moving, not in the way of the living, not breath, not a turning of the head, something subtler, a slow loosening, a drifting, the way smoke drifts upward without intention. She was descending. Down through the earth she had helped to birth, down through the roots of the mountains and the cold dark beneath the rivers, down toward the place that had no name yet, but that her arrival would make real. Nomi, the land of the dead, the shadowed realm beneath all things. Izanagi reached out as if he might catch her, might hold her at the threshold by the sheer force of his wanting. But there was nothing to hold. She had already passed through some door he could not see, some seam in the world that opened only one way. Then the silence she left behind was of a different quality than the silences he had known before. Those had been warm silences, full of breath and presence. This one was hollow. It had weight without warmth. It pressed against him like a stone. He sat at the edge of that invisible threshold for what felt like a very long time, long enough for the stars to wheel overhead and the sea wind to shift and the darkness to settle fully over the world. He pressed his hands flat against the earth, as though he might feel her somewhere below him, as though closeness to the ground were a kind of closeness to her. Maybe it was. He told himself that it was. The world went on breathing around him. The soft movement of leaves, the distant sound of water, the slow passage of clouds across the face of the moon. It was the same world he had churned from the sea with his beloved beside him. It was the same world where they had stood together on the floating bridge, looking down at the formless deep, full of something that might have been wonder, or might have been love, or might have been both at once, because the two were never very different. It was the same world, and she was gone from it. He did not know, in that long, aching stillness, what he would do next. He did not know that he would follow her. He did not know what following her would cost him, or what terrible thing he would find waiting on the other side of the dark. For now he only knew the grief. He sat with it, there on the skin of the world, in the quiet that she had left behind. And the night deepened around him as nights do, slowly and without asking permission, and without any promise of what the morning might bring. He rose, in the end, as the grieving always do, not because the sorrow had lifted, not because he had found some measure of peace in the long, cold hours of sitting. He rose because love, when it is deep enough, does not allow a person to remain still. It pulls. It insists. And so Izanagi gathered himself in the darkness, turned away from the living world, and walked toward the place where the light did not reach. Yomi lay beneath the earth like a held breath. There is no single door, no great gate that opens and shuts, or so the old stories say. It is more like a deepening, a place where the path simply descends and descends, and the warmth of the world above grows thinner, and the air loses the smell of rain and green things, and something older and heavier takes its place. The stone around him wept with moisture. The dark was not merely the absence of light, it was a presence of its own, slow and patient and very old. Still, he descended. He called her name as he went, and his voice moved strangely in that place. The sound swallowed quickly, as though the shadows were hungry for it. He called again, and somewhere ahead, or perhaps below, something shifted. She was there. Her voice came to him before she did, soft and careful and unmistakably hers. She told him to stop where he stood. She told him not to come any closer. There was a great heaviness in her words, a sorrow shaped differently from his own, as though she had been carrying it longer and had learned its weight in ways he had not yet begun to understand. Izanagi told her he had come to bring her home. For a long moment there was only silence, the kind of silence that thinks. Then she spoke again. She said she would go to the gods of Yomi and she would ask them to release her. She said it was possible, perhaps, that such a thing could be done. But he must wait for her. He must not follow where she went. He must not under any circumstance bring fire into the dark to look upon her. This was the condition. This was all she asked of him. She spoke it clearly, and then her voice receded, and her footsteps moved away into the deeper shadows, and he was alone again. So he waited. The waiting was its own kind of descent. Time in Yomi does not move as it does above. There is no arc of sun to mark its passage, no bird song to signal the turning of the hours. There is only the dark and the damp and the low, almost inaudible sound the silence makes when it presses close. He waited until the waiting became a thing with weight and texture. He waited until hope and doubt braided themselves together so tightly he could no longer tell them apart. She did not return, and something in him, that human, aching, unbearable thing that love becomes when it is frightened, broke. He reached into his hair where he had wound a comb among the strands, as men did in those days when traveling far from home. He drew it free, broke away one of its teeth, held it out before him and breathed a small flame onto it, the way a parent cups a candle from the wind. The light was tiny, gentle, almost nothing, but in Yomi, even the smallest light sees everything, What he found waiting in that flicker of illumination was not the woman he had loved, or rather, she was still there, still his Izanami, and some part of him knew it, felt it, even in the first terrible instant. But the form that love had lived within was changed beyond returning. What the fire revealed was ruin, a body given over to darkness and to the slow, merciless processes of the deep earth. Around her moved things that should not be seen. The 8 thunder gods, born of her transformation, writhing and roaring in the shadows that her body had become. Izanagi ran. The shame and the horror moved through him in a single wave, and then his legs were carrying him back the way he had come, back through the weeping stone passages, back through the deepening dark, toward the world he had left behind. Behind him, the sound rose, a sound that was not quite roaring and not quite wailing, but something between the two, something that had never existed in the living world and had no name there. Izanami's voice came through it, changed now, raw with fury and with grief in equal measure. She called to the Shikomi, the foul women of Yomi, to give chase, to bring him back. To not let him leave. The pursuit was swift and terrible. He ran through passages where the walls breathed cold, where the stones seemed to narrow and lean as though the underworld itself wanted to hold him. The Shikome came behind him like a tide. He reached into his hair again and flung grapes and bamboo shoots, provisions he had carried, transformed by desperation into something miraculous. And the pursuers slowed to gather them the way hunger will always pause a predator, even in the dark. But still they came. The 8 thunder gods came next, rolling and crashing through the tunnels, and the sound of them was immense. Izanagi drew his sword and swung it behind him as he ran, not to fight, but to scatter, to make the path behind him uncertain, dangerous, full of shadow and doubt. And it slowed them, not enough, never quite enough. The passage ahead began to brighten, not greatly, not warmly, but there was something ahead that was less than the absolute dark of Yomi, and he ran toward it the way a drowning person moves toward air, without thought, without choice, with every remaining piece of himself committed entirely to reaching it. As the night deepened behind him and the pale outline of the world above came into reach, he found growing near the mouth of that terrible place a peach tree, heavy with fruit. He seized 3 of the peaches and hurled them back into the darkness, back toward the shapes that still came howling after him. The peaches struck, and the pursuit stumbled and fell back, the old power of that living fruit too warm, too full of the world's green life for the creatures of Yomi to withstand. For a moment, the passage behind him went quiet. Only a moment. Then her voice came once more. Izanami's voice, stripped now of everything soft, carrying the full weight of what had passed between them, what had been broken and could not be mended. She was coming herself. And so Izanagi ran the last distance, ran with the sound of her fury at his back, ran toward the pale and growing light until the stone gave way beneath his feet and the air changed and the smell of the living world, rain and soil and the distant salt of the sea, rushed over him like a wave. He had made it out, breathing hard, shaking, profoundly, irreversibly changed. Behind him, the entrance to Yomi yawned open in the hillside, and from within it came the sound of her still coming, still furious, the grief and the rage so bound together now that neither could be named separately. He had only a moment, and he knew, in that moment, exactly what he had to do. He pressed his hands against it, the great boulder that rested at the mouth of the hill, and with the last of his strength, with everything his grief and his terror and his long love had left in him, he pushed. The stone moved slowly at first. Then, like a decision finally made, it rolled into place with a sound like the world settling into itself. A low, resonant thud that seemed to pass through the ground and up into the air and out across the quiet hills beyond. Silence followed, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of completion. For a moment, Izanagi simply stood there, one hand still resting on the face of the stone, his breathing ragged, his whole body trembling with exhaustion. Then, from the other side, muffled now, softened by the great weight of the barrier between them, he heard her voice. It was not the shrieking voice of what had pursued him through the dark. It was older than that, quieter, the voice he had first known in the long-ago time when they had stood together on the floating bridge and stirred the ocean into islands. "You have shamed me," she said, and he felt the truth of it like a stone in his chest. "I know," he answered. A long pause settled between them, as wide and as deep as everything that had happened. "Then know this also," Izanami said, her voice low and final as the turning of a season. "Each day I will take 1,000 souls from the living world into mine." He bowed his head against the stone. He did not weep. He was beyond weeping now. "Still," he answered, and his voice was steady. "Then each day I will see to it that 1,500 souls are born into the light." Perhaps there was nothing more to say. Perhaps some endings do not ask for words, only for the slow, aching acknowledgement that what was, and what is now, and that between the two lies a boulder no one will ever move again. Izanagi straightened. He turned from the stone, and so it was that he walked away from Yomi, not quickly, not as a man fleeing, but as a man who had finally fully understood the shape of his own sorrow. He walked down through the pale hills and out into the open country. And as he walked, the light grew, soft at first, like the very first suggestion of morning on the horizon, then warmer, then real. He found a river. It ran clear and calm over smooth stones, murmuring the way rivers do when they have been running a long time and have no particular hurry left in them. He stood at its edge for a moment, feeling the sun on his face, the actual sun, warm and ordinary and extraordinary. And then he waded in. The water was cool. It moved around him with a gentle insistence, and as it touched him, as it carried away the darkness and the ash and the long shadow of Yomi from his skin, something shifted in the world. From the water that washed from his left eye, there arose a light so warm and so full and so endlessly generous that the whole sky seemed to inhale with wonder. Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, she rose from the river in a shimmering silence, and the heavens opened to receive her. And she took her place above all things like a promise kept after a very long time. From the water that washed from his right eye came a cooler, silver luminescence. Tsukuyomi, the god of the moon, who would govern the long nights with a calm and measured grace, a lantern for the dreaming world. From the water that washed from his nose came Susanoo, the god of storms, wild and weeping, and full of a feeling he could not yet name. Born into the world with all the emotion his father had no words left to carry. 3 divine children, born of grief made clean. 3 lights stepping into a world that had been, until this moment, waiting for exactly them. Izanagi stood in the shallows and watched them, and something in him grew quiet. Not empty, never empty, but still. The way a forest goes still after rain, when every leaf holds a small bright bead of water and the air smells of earth and beginning. The world he and Izanami had made together remained. The island still rose from the sea. The mountains still held their ancient patience. The rivers still carried their silver murmuring down to the shore. The wind still moved through the grasses the way it always had, as if it had nowhere better to be. Nothing had been undone. What had been lost was real. What had been broken would stay broken. But the world, in its vast and unhurried way, had held all of it. The love, the loss, the fire, the dark, the long journey home, and had not flinched. Amaterasu rose higher, and her light fell on everything without exception, on the mountains and the rivers, on the sleeping grasses, on a father standing in a cool river, his eyes closed, his face turned upward. The story had reached its shore, and the world, luminous and whole and gently breathing, moved on into the long, untroubled light.